At the jagged edge of whispering pines, where the trees lean in as if to eavesdrop, stood an old barn that appeared to have been forgotten by time itself. Inside, however, was a chaotic and magnificent kingdom of noise, the Aris Sound Studio. Tables groaned under the weight of thousands of disparate objects. Rows of mismatched shoes, tangled webs of rusted iron chains, and mounds of dry autumn leaves that crunched with every shift in the air. Kael, a man in his early 30s, with eyes that seemed to hear the world before they saw it, stepped through the heavy, groaning oak doors. A former musician who had lost his rhythm in the deafening roar of the city, he had come here seeking a place where he could hide in the quiet, textured shadows of sound. Master Aris sat behind a massive, smudged glass pane, his fingers hovering over an ancient mixing console like a predatory spider on its web. He didn't bother to look up when Kael entered, the only greeting being the cold mechanical hum of the equipment. Without a word, he pointed a long, skeletal finger toward a microphone hanging precariously over a deep pit of sand. "Every fool with a mouth can make a noise, boy." Aris's voice crackled through the intercom, sounding more like gravel under a boot than a human tone. "But few can make that noise tell a story. Give me the sound of a heart breaking without uttering a single word, or I shall have no use for you." In the dim, dust-filled corner of the booth, a shadow detached itself from the wall and stepped into the pale light. It was Seraphina, Aris's daughter, a woman of delicate features and intense, watchful eyes that seemed to vibrate with the frequencies of the room. Her hands were permanently stained with the grey dust of the studio, a mark of a life spent in isolation. Having grown up within these wooden walls, she had learned the secret language of objects long before she understood the complexities of people. She stepped toward Kael and handed him a thin, frosted glass ornament, her touch lingering on the cold surface for a second too long, her gaze a silent challenge and an invitation. Kael did not do the obvious. He did not shatter the glass. Instead, he took a rusted metal file from the workbench and began to graze the surface of the delicate ornament with an agonizing rhythmic slowness. The sound it produced was a high, thin wail, the sound of something fragile being slowly stripped of its protective layer. Then with his other hand, he let a single drop of water fall onto a glowing hot metal plate nearby, creating a sharp, final hiss of steam. It was haunting, a sonic portrait of a soul evaporating. Behind the glass, Master Aris froze, his fingers finally still. He had spent 40 years searching for that specific, hollow tone of grief, and here it was, born from rust and glass. "You start at dawn, do not be late," Aris muttered, his voice losing some of its sharp edge as he turned back to his flickering monitors. Kael let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, the heavy tension finally leaving his shoulders like a receding tide. As he turned to leave, he passed Seraphina once more, her presence as quiet as a held breath. She was already busy, her fingers pressing deeply into a tray of white cornstarch to mimic the heavy, muffled sound of footsteps in deep, fresh snow. She looked up at him briefly and let out a soft, melodic hum that perfectly matched the frequency of the glass he had just played. It was a welcome, a warning, and a shared secret, vibrating through the floorboards beneath his boots. The weeks that followed were a sensory blur of textures, echoes, and the discovery of hidden meanings. Kael quickly realized that Seraphina was the true beating soul of the Aris Sound Studio. While her father obsessed over the technical perfection and digital clarity of the recordings, Seraphina understood the raw, messy emotion behind every single creak of a floorboard or the rustle of a curtain. Kael found himself mesmerized by her, the way she navigated the cluttered barn with a rhythmic grace, never making an accidental sound. They began to communicate in the language of their surroundings. A sharp tap on a wooden beam meant, "Good morning," while the soft, deliberate rustle of silk across a table meant, "Be careful, he is watching." The first major peak in their relationship arrived during a late-night session for a grueling period drama. They were squeezed together into a small, soundproof wooden booth, tasked with recording the complex sounds of a couple dancing in a torrential rainstorm. Kael held the water sprayer, his arms aching, while Seraphina stepped into a pair of heavy, oversized leather boots to provide the percussion of the dance. The space was so confined their shoulders remained in constant contact, and the air grew thick with the scent of damp leather and the faint, haunting aroma of Seraphina's lavender perfume. As they moved in perfect, breathless sync to the rhythm of their imaginary storm, the line between their professional performance and a deeply personal reality began to dissolve into the mist. In the suffocating heat of the booth, Seraphina's breath hitched, a sound more powerful than any storm they could simulate. Kael stopped the sprayer, leaving only the low electrical hum of the recording equipment to fill the silence. They stood inches apart, the air between them heavy with the weight of 40 years of unspoken words and the electric charge of a forbidden connection. Kael reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed a stray, damp hair from her forehead. Seraphina did not pull away, instead she leaned into his touch, her eyes searching his for a reflection of the music they were creating together. For that one resonant moment, the master watching from behind the glass didn't exist. Suddenly the intercom crackled to life with a sharp, distorted burst of static. "Again from the top!" Aris shouted, his voice laced with a newfound suspicion that cut through their intimacy. "The rhythm was off. You're losing the beat, Kael. Focus on the work, not the atmosphere." They sprang apart instantly, their faces flushed and their hearts racing in a frantic staccato. Through the glass, Kael could see Aris staring at them, his eyes narrowed and dark with a father's protective instinct and a master's growing jealousy. Aris knew better than anyone that once a Foley artist loses their professional detachment, the art is compromised by the truth of their own feelings, and he would not allow his perfect silence to be ruined. Later that night, as Kael prepared to leave for his small, drafty room in the village, he found a small, peculiar object resting on his workbench. It was a tiny brass gear, meticulously modified with a small, soft feather attached to its rotating side. When he gave it a gentle spin, it didn't click like a clock. Instead, it made a sound like a soft, fluttering heartbeat, rhythmic and comforting. It was Seraphina's unique way of confessing that she felt the same resonance he did. Kael tucked the small treasure into his pocket, his own heart full of a sound he couldn't name. He knew that loving the master's daughter in a house of enforced silence was a dangerous gamble, but the music they made was far too beautiful to stop now. As the winter winds began to howl through the pines, the atmosphere inside the studio became increasingly claustrophobic and tense. Aris, sensing the invisible thread between his apprentice and his daughter, began to assign them separate shifts, desperate to keep the noise of their affection from polluting the purity of his recordings. But the more he tried to isolate them, the more ingenious and desperate they became in their communication. They began to hide short coded recordings for each other within the vast digital archives, a few seconds of a rare bird's wing beat at the end of a mundane file, or a hidden track of a soft shared laugh buried deep beneath the booming sound of a thunder effect. The chapter concludes with Kael standing alone in the deep, freezing snow outside the barn, his breath rising in pale, frantic clouds. He looks up at the attic window where Seraphina's light still burns, a lonely lighthouse in the dark. From the studio below, a low, rumbling bass tone begins to emanate, the sound Aris uses to signal the final end of the workday. But tonight it feels like an omen of something much darker. The unique, fragile world they have carefully constructed out of whispers, echoes, and hidden gears is about to face its greatest and most silent test. The silence is coming for them, and Kael is no longer sure if the music of their love is loud enough to drown out the master's cold final chime. One heart beats in the booth, another in the attic. The music of Whispering Pines is changing, and the silence will never be the same again. Thank you for being part of this unique journey. Please subscribe to follow Kael and Seraphina's story, and don't forget to check out the description for more details. We will see you in the next chapter. Sleep well and keep the echoes close.